What if I told you the most dangerous person in any room isn't the loud one, isn't the intense one, isn't the passionate one? It's the one who feels nothing, or at least looks like they do. The one who doesn't react, doesn't flinch, doesn't care about proving anything to anyone. The one who sits in silence, watching. That person, that's the threat, because passion is predictable. Anger is predictable. Fear is predictable. Emotion can be used, redirected, controlled. But detachment, you can't control someone who isn't emotionally invested, and deep down, everyone knows it. That's why people get uncomfortable around calm minds. It's not the lack of emotion that scares them. It's the lack of emotional control over them. We don't fear people who feel nothing. We fear people who can't be manipulated by feeling anything. Picture this. Two people in a meeting. One is loud, expressive, full of fire. You know exactly what they want, exactly what they fear. The other, still, unmoved, silent. Everyone hears the first person, but everyone watches the second. Why? Because the first one is readable, and the readable can be managed. The second one, you don't know what they're thinking, and that makes them dangerous. Society worships passion, but passion is just emotional fuel, and fuel burns out. Control doesn't. The emotionally detached visionary doesn't run on passion. They run on clarity. They don't need your approval. They don't need your energy. They don't need to be understood. They only need the mission. Carl Jung understood this type of mind before the world ever had a name for it. He said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Most people never do. They adjust themselves to be accepted, to belong, to be liked. The detached visionary doesn't, and that's why they're feared. Because they don't bend, they don't chase, they don't react the way people expect. Their calm is not passivity, it's sovereignty. Detachment isn't numbness, it's ownership of the inner world. They can feel without being moved, think without being overwhelmed, choose without being pressured. That's what makes them powerful. The average person reacts. The detached visionary decides. The average person needs emotional validation. The detached visionary needs only alignment. The average person is controlled by fear, approval, belonging. The detached visionary is controlled by nothing outside of themselves. That's why systems don't know what to do with them. You can't guilt them. You can't shame them. You can't push them with urgency or panic or drama. You can take everything from them and they'll simply walk away. You can't break someone who isn't emotionally attached to what you're holding hostage. And that is why the calmest person in the room is usually the most dangerous. Not because they lack emotion, but because they have mastered it. They don't abandon logic for belonging. They don't trade clarity for connection. They don't collapse when approval disappears. They're not hard to read by accident. They're hard to control by design. That is the power of detachment. And it is the one thing society cannot tame. Because once someone stops needing the tribe can no longer use emotion as a leash. So remember this. We don't fear people who have no emotions. We fear people who own theirs so completely that no one else can use them. And in a world addicted to reaction, the one who stays still becomes the one in control. Not weakness, not coldness, not apathy, sovereignty. You've seen this person before. Not the loud leader, not the charismatic motivator, not the emotional storyteller, the one in the back. Silent, unmoved, watching the room like they're already 5 steps ahead of it. They don't interrupt. They don't compete. They don't chase attention because they don't need the room. The room needs them. This is the emotionally detached visionary, the person who doesn't get pulled into the noise because they can already see the signal. Most people live inside emotion. They swim in it, react to it, drown in it. The visionary stands outside of it, not because they don't feel, but because they refuse to let feelings cloud perception. That distance, that psychological space, is what gives them vision, not eyesight, not intelligence. Vision, the ability to see what others can't, because others are too busy reacting to what's right in front of them. Carl Jung would have called this person an outsider to the collective, not because they reject humanity, but because they are not owned by it. Jung wrote, "The individual must detach from the collective to become who they truly are." Most people never do. They stay fused to the tribe, the crowd, the emotional atmosphere around them. The visionary breaks from it. That break is what gives them clarity, and that clarity is what makes them dangerous. They're not influenced by emotional trends. They don't bend to public panic. They don't respond to social pressure the way the collective needs them to. That's why society misunderstands them first and needs them later. Every major leap in history began with a mind that separated from the emotional behavior of the herd. The herd reacts. The visionary observes. The herd fears the unknown. The visionary studies it. The herd follows rules. The visionary rewrites them. It's not that they don't feel. It's that they don't obey emotions. They don't chase belonging. They don't fear being misunderstood. They don't collapse when they're not validated. They can walk alone and still walk forward. People call that cold, but it isn't cold. It's self-contained. People call it detached, and it is, strategically. A detached mind is a free mind. A free mind is an unpredictable force, and an unpredictable force cannot be absorbed into the system. That's why the visionary always starts as a threat. Before becoming a blueprint, they aren't here to fit into the world. They're here to see beyond it. The emotionally reactive live inside the moment. The emotionally detached live above it. Like someone standing on a hill watching a storm sweep through the valley. They see the shape, the direction, the timing. They aren't panicking because they're not inside the storm. That is why people fear them, because they can't be pulled into emotional chaos. They can't be controlled by urgency. They can't be rushed, flattered, guilted, or pressured. They choose when to move, and when they do move, they move with precision, not impulse. They don't waste energy trying to convince the world. They conserve energy until it's time to change it. The visionary is not the loudest person in the room. They are the one whose silence makes everyone else think louder. And that's the real reason the detached are misunderstood. People assume that if you're not emotionally expressive, you must not care. But the truth is the opposite. They care too much to let emotion blind them. Detachment is not the absence of emotion. It is the mastery of it. The visionary doesn't react to life. They position themselves above it. That elevation, that distance, is what allows them to see the pattern no one else sees. Right before they change everything. Everyone thinks society is built on logic, on rules, on structure, but it isn't. Society runs on emotion, fear, approval, belonging, guilt, shame. Those are the real engines. People don't follow laws because they've studied them. They follow laws because they're afraid of consequences. People don't chase success because they love purpose. They chase it because they fear being seen as a failure. People don't post achievements online for fulfillment. They post them for validation. The world is emotionally programmed, and the system depends on it, because emotional people are predictable, and predictable people are controllable. But the emotionally detached visionary breaks the program. You can't shame someone who doesn't need approval. You can't pressure someone who doesn't feel urgency. You can't scare someone who isn't emotionally tied to loss. The whole leverage system collapses. That's why society doesn't actually fear the heartless. It fears the unreachable, the person who can walk away, the person who doesn't need acceptance, the person who doesn't crumble when rejected. That person is a threat to every structure built on emotional obedience. Think about it. School trains you to raise your hand, to wait for permission, to be evaluated by others. Jobs train you to perform for approval, to fear criticism, to treat your identity like a resume. Relationships train you to fear abandonment, to give parts of yourself away for stability. Every system says the same thing. Feel what we want you to feel. Care about what we tell you matters. React the way we expect. But the emotionally detached visionary looks at all of that and doesn't bite the hook. They don't run on approval. They don't need applause. They don't panic when someone disapproves. You can't herd someone who has no emotional need to belong to the herd. And that's what makes them powerful. Not dominance, not superiority, not aggression, just freedom from emotional programming. Jung understood this. He wrote, "The individual has always had to struggle not to be overwhelmed by the tribe. Most people lose that struggle. They become the tribe, same beliefs, same fears, same emotional triggers. The visionary steps outside the circle, not to rebel, not to act superior, but because they can't see clearly while standing inside the crowd. Distance is clarity, clarity is power, and that power threatens the tribe because the tribe needs emotional agreement to survive. It needs shared fear, shared outrage, shared excitement. That's how mobs form, how trends go viral, how social movements happen, emotional synchronization. So what do you call the person who is immune to that? A threat, a problem, a danger, or in history's language, a revolutionary. Not because they want to destroy society, but because they can't be absorbed into it. They don't look for the right moment to fit in. They look for the right moment to change things. And that distance, that emotional self-possession, is what gives them the leverage no one else has. The attached person says, "I hope they let me." The detached visionary says, "I don't need them to." The attached person asks, "What if they don't approve?" The detached visionary asks, "What if it doesn't matter?" And that is the crack in the system. One person without emotional dependence is more dangerous than 1,000 people screaming with passion, because passion can be redirected. But detachment can't be moved. The system doesn't know what to do with someone who is free on the inside. And that is why society fears the emotionally detached, because their existence proves something uncomfortable. You don't have to play the emotional game to win the real one. People think fear comes from danger. It doesn't. Fear comes from uncertainty, and nothing creates more uncertainty in a person's mind than someone they can't predict. That's why people get anxious around calm, unreadable personalities, not because they seem cold, but because they can't be emotionally mapped. When someone yells, you know they're angry. When someone cries, you know they're hurt. When someone panics, you know they're overwhelmed. But when someone shows nothing, your mind has no data, and the brain hates the unknown. So instead of understanding them, we label them cold, aloof, emotionless, uncaring, dangerous. Not because of what they've done, but because we can't control how they feel. Emotional unpredictability scares people, but emotional detachment terrifies them, because when someone doesn't respond the way you expect, your emotional leverage dies instantly. You can't guilt them, you can't provoke them, you can't get a rise out of them, you can't pull them into your chaos. And people who can't be emotionally moved are treated like they can't be human, because most people associate emotion with morality. If you don't react the way I would react, you must not care. That's the false logic of the emotional majority. But here's the truth. Detachment isn't the absence of caring. It's the absence of emotional control by others. And that difference is everything. The expressive leader depends on emotional engagement. The detached observer doesn't need it. One leads with intensity. The other leads with inevitability. One plays the moment. The other plays the timeline. And that's exactly why the silent one is more powerful, because silence isn't passive. Silence is unreadable. Silence is control. The calm person in the room is not calm because they lack feeling. They're calm because they've already processed the feeling internally. Everyone else is reacting in real time. The detached visionary already reacted hours ago in their head. So what you're seeing isn't numbness. It's strategy. Carl Jung understood this type deeply. He said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." The detached visionary has already faced theirs. That's why they aren't thrown around by emotion, their own or anyone else's. And when you've mastered your inner world, you stop being controlled by the outer one. That's what makes them dangerous. Not their intelligence, not their calm, not their silence, but the fact that they can't be emotionally recruited into the crowd. You can't buy their loyalty with praise. You can't force compliance with disapproval. You can't manipulate them with fear of exile. They are psychologically untethered, and the world is built to control the tethered. So when someone shows up who doesn't need the approval system, doesn't need the emotional reward system, doesn't need the belonging system, the system panics. Because that person can't be owned. They don't cooperate out of guilt. They don't submit out of fear. They don't obey out of emotional dependence. They obey only what they believe. And someone who obeys only themselves is someone the world cannot domesticate. That's the real threat. Not a person with no emotion, but a person whose emotion is not available for manipulation. A person whose inner world belongs to them, not to the crowd. And the moment you stop needing emotional permission, you become the one thing society cannot control: self-governed. The system needs emotion to control people, but the emotionally detached visionary isn't plugged into that system, and that's the glitch. Because once someone stops responding to emotional pressure, they stop being predictable. And once they stop being predictable, they stop being controllable. That's when people start calling them dangerous, not because they're violent, not because they're reckless, but because they cannot be steered by emotional consequence. You can threaten to embarrass them. They don't care. You can threaten to exclude them. They'll leave first. You can threaten to ruin their reputation. They don't live off reputation. You can threaten to take something away. They weren't attached to it. How do you control someone who feels no emotional loss? You can't. And that's when society turns from influence to fear. It always happens the same way. First, they say you're different. Then they say you're cold. Then they say you're heartless. Then they say you're a danger, because people don't actually fear what they don't like. They fear what they can't move. People feel safe around emotional people, even angry, jealous, dramatic, unstable people, because at least you know how to push them. But the detached one, the one who doesn't react to your tone, your pressure, your energy, that person forces you to confront yourself. You can't pull them into your storm. They just stay on the shore, watching you drown in your own waves. That's when irritation starts, because whether people realize it or not, emotion is a power game. We get loud to force attention. We cry to force comfort. We panic to force urgency. We guilt to force responsibility. We get offended to force apology. But the detached visionary does not play. You can throw emotion at them like fire, and they just watch the sparks die out before they reach them. That level of internal steadiness feels threatening to people who build identity out of emotional reaction. So instead of asking, how are they so calm? People decide something is wrong with them, because it's easier to demonize someone than admit they have mastered something you never could. Carl Jung once said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. That irritation you feel around the detached one, it's not about their silence. It's about your lack of it. It's not about their emotional neutrality. It's about your emotional dependency. They don't trigger you because they are flawed. They trigger you because they are free. And freedom always exposes attachment. That's why the emotionally neutral are feared, not because they're inhuman, but because they're unbound. They don't carry the weight of approval. They don't collect emotional debt. They don't build identity on reaction. And once you stop reacting, you stop being controlled by anything outside yourself. That's the real revolution. Not rebellion, not anger, not destruction, but indifference to the emotional chains that keep everyone else obedient. When someone can look at the entire emotional economy of society and simply say, I don't need this, that person becomes untouchable. And the untouchable will always be called dangerous by those who depend on everyone staying touched. The emotionally detached visionary isn't trying to escape emotion. They've just stepped outside the emotional marketplace everyone else is trapped in, because most people don't feel emotions. They negotiate with them. They act kind to be liked. They act busy to be respected. They act humble to avoid judgment. They act confident to hide insecurity. They act outraged to look righteous. Everything becomes performance, but the detached person doesn't perform. And that's why people think something is off. Because in a world where everyone is emotionally signaling, authentic neutrality feels like a threat. The detached visionary doesn't smile to be approved. They don't soften their tone to be accepted. They don't hide their thoughts to be safe. They don't trade emotional expression for social advantage. They don't weaponize feelings to gain power. They simply are. And that level of inner self-possession is so rare. People don't even recognize it as a strength until they need them, until things collapse, until chaos hits, until everyone else is reacting in fear, and the one who feels least is the one who sees most. That's when detachment becomes leadership, not emotional hype, not motivational energy, not let's all feel this together, but stillness, clarity, precision, because emotion makes crowds predictable, but detachment makes individuals decisive. And history has always been shaped by the decisive ones, not the ones who felt the loudest, but the ones who saw the farthest. People assume the detached don't care, but what if the opposite is true? What if the detached care so deeply about the mission that they refuse to be owned by the moment? They're not cold, they're calibrated, they're not numb, they're selective, they're not disconnected from emotion, they're disconnected from emotional manipulation. And that is the key difference. They don't suppress emotion, they master the distance between feeling and action. That gap, that pause, is power, because the person who reacts first is not the person in control. The one who waits, watches, thinks, is the one who eventually moves the board. That is why the detached one is not the loudest, but they are the last one standing. Because feelings burn out, crowds burn out, movements burn out, but clarity doesn't burn. Clarity endures. And once someone discovers the strength of inner stillness, no emotional storm can recruit them again. They don't get addicted to highs. They don't get enslaved by lows. They don't need noise to feel alive. They have something everyone else traded away: uninterrupted self-direction. That is the real threat. A human being who cannot be emotionally steered is a human being the world cannot use. Not as a follower, not as a pawn, not as a people pleaser, not as a guilt machine, not as a validation addict. They become something extremely rare, a free mind inside, a controlled society, and everything that depends on emotional obedience crumbles in the presence of someone who simply doesn't respond. That's why the detached are feared, not because they lack emotion, but because their emotion no longer belongs to the world. The emotionally detached visionary is not trying to be different. They just can't live inside the emotional rules everyone else agreed to without ever questioning them. Because once you see how emotion is used to control the world, you stop letting the world tell you how to feel. And once you stop letting the world tell you how to feel, you stop living the life it wanted you to live. People say detachment is dangerous, but what they really mean is you're no longer easy to manipulate. Because the moment you stop reacting the way people expect, they lose their power over you. And power built on emotional leverage dies the second you refuse to play. That's why when someone is calm when they should be upset, or silent when they should respond, or unfazed when they should care, people don't know what to do. They can't decode you. They can't sway you. They can't use your emotions against you. So instead, they attack your character. You don't care. You're cold. You're heartless. You're disconnected from reality. But what they're really saying is, I can't control you. And that scares me, because emotional control only works on the emotionally dependent. If you need approval, they can shame you. If you need belonging, they can exclude you. If you need to be liked, they can threaten your image. If you need to be seen as good, they can guilt you. But what do you do with the person who says, I don't need any of that? That person becomes untouchable. And untouchable people are always labeled as dangerous until time proves they were right. Every era has them. The thinker who didn't follow the group, the inventor who didn't need applause, the leader who didn't bend to emotion, the creator who didn't seek validation, the rebel who didn't need permission. They weren't the loud ones. They weren't the dramatic ones. They weren't the emotionally impressive ones. They were the ones who could walk away, not because they didn't care, but because they cared more about the truth than the tribe. That is the real essence of the detached visionary. They don't need the world to agree in order to know they're right. Everyone else needs emotional confirmation. The detached need only internal clarity. And internal clarity is the most feared thing on this planet, because the moment someone's inner world becomes more real than the outer one, they are no longer governable. They don't need to be understood. They don't need to be approved. They don't need to be accepted. They are self-sustaining. And society has no defense against a person who no longer needs anything it can offer or threaten. That is why detachment is feared, not because it is emotionless, but because it is untouchable. The emotionally detached visionary is not numb. They're not empty. They're not broken. They are simply not owned by what owns everyone else. They don't chase respect. They decide who earns theirs. They don't chase love. They give it without becoming dependent on it. They don't chase purpose. They embody it. They don't live to be seen. They live to see clearly. And clarity is a threat in a world built on emotional fog, because the moment someone sees clearly, they stop reacting the way the world needs them to react. They stop buying what fear is selling. They stop obeying what guilt is demanding. They stop performing what approval is rewarding. They simply watch, think, move only when they decide movement matters. And when someone stops being emotionally programmable, the world can no longer predict their moves. Predictable people are controlled. Unpredictable people rewrite the rules. That's why every system, political, social, religious, economic, tries to convince you that detachment is wrong. They will tell you, you need to care more. You need to show emotion. You need to feel what we feel. But what they really mean is stay inside the emotional network where we can monitor and manage you. Because as long as you feel what the crowd feels, you will do what the crowd does. But the detached visionary, they step out of the collective emotional field and think for themselves. That is the one thing the world does not want. Independent emotional software, because once your emotions stop syncing with the group, your actions stop serving the group. You stop being a follower. You stop being a consumer. You stop being obedient. You become a sovereign. And sovereign minds don't join mobs. Sovereign minds don't collapse under pressure. Sovereign minds don't justify their truth with noise. Jung understood this better than anyone. He said, "Freedom of the mind is not given, it is taken." That's what detachment really is. A quiet revolution inside the self. Not rebellion through anger, but rebellion through emotional independence. And the more detached you become, the more you'll notice something strange. People don't argue with you to change your mind. They argue because your calm exposes their lack of it. Your stillness makes their chaos obvious. Your neutrality makes their emotional addiction visible. Your self-possession forces them to face what they never mastered. And people would rather call you broken than admit they are controlled by everything you are free from. So they label you cold, distant, unemotional, inhuman. But the truth is simple. You are not less human. You are just less owned. And in a world built on emotional ownership, the one who owns themselves will always be treated like a threat. They don't fear that you feel less. They fear that you need less, because needing less is the beginning of real power, not power over others, pure. Power over yourself. When you don't need constant reassurance, people can't trap you with silence. When you don't need agreement, people can't trap you with disagreement. When you don't need approval, people can't trap you with judgment. When you don't need emotional safety, people can't threaten you with emotional chaos. That's the shift. You don't become invincible by feeling nothing. You become invincible by no longer being controlled by what you feel. And that level of internal stability looks unreal to people who live inside emotional storms every day. They think you don't care, but they're wrong. You just don't collapse from caring. You don't lose yourself in the feeling. You don't drown in reaction. You don't trade your clarity for comfort. You can feel deeply and still stay steady. You can love and still walk away when the path demands it. You can hurt and still choose direction over despair. That is the strength they mistake for coldness. Emotionally detached doesn't mean you lack emotion. It means you don't hand your emotions to the world like a weapon they can use against you. It means you've taken your power back from guilt, from shame, from pressure, from panic, from approval, from urgency, from noise. And once you reclaim that power, you become something extremely rare, self-regulated in a world that runs on emotional chaos. That's why the quiet ones get underestimated. That's why the calm ones get mislabeled. That's why the unreactive ones get called dangerous. Because the world is not built for people who don't need it emotionally. It's built for the ones who do. The ones who need applause, need belonging, need permission, need validation, need acceptance, need comfort, need reassurance. Those people are predictable. Those people stay in line. Those people fuel the system. But the detached visionary, they are the exception. They don't have to be persuaded. They don't have to be included. They don't have to be liked. They move without emotional chains, and that makes them impossible to program. The world doesn't know what to do with someone who is free inside, so it does the only thing it can. It tries to make them doubt that freedom. Why don't you react? Why don't you care like everyone else? What's wrong with you? But nothing is wrong. The only thing wrong is that you're no longer emotionally compliant. And someone who doesn't respond to emotional control is someone the world can't govern. That is why they fear detachment, not because it is empty, but because it is ungovernable. They will tell you to open up. They will tell you to feel more. They will tell you to be vulnerable. But what they really mean is, be emotionally available so we can predict you, so we can manage you, so we can shape you. Because the moment you stop reacting, the moment you stop depending, the moment you stop seeking emotional permission, you step outside the invisible fence. And nothing threatens a controlled environment more than someone who can walk past the boundary without needing to be chased back inside. You don't argue, you don't explain, you don't defend, you just don't return. That is the power of detachment. It doesn't shout. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need validation for existing. It just leaves the emotional contract that everyone else is still trying to negotiate. Most people don't want truth. They want emotional comfort disguised as truth. Most people don't want freedom. They want freedom as long as it doesn't cost them belonging. But the detached visionary has already paid that price. They already lost the crowd. They already broke the script. They already stepped out of the emotional economy. And once you've done that, you never go back to dependency. Your peace no longer comes from agreement. Your confidence no longer comes from applause. Your direction no longer comes from approval. You are not powered by external fuel anymore. And people don't know what to do with someone who runs on an internal source. They can't cut you off. They can't slow you down. They can't guilt you into staying. They can't shame you into surrendering. You're not plugged into their outlet. You've built your own generator, and that right there is the true threat of emotional detachment. It creates a human being who is not emotionally harvestable, someone who can think without fear, speak without permission, act without validation, someone who cannot be emotionally steered by reward or punishment. A free internal state in a world of external control mechanisms. That is why Jung understood this type so deeply. He didn't call them broken. He didn't call them numb. He didn't call them cold. He called them individuated, a person who is separated from the collective emotional field and claim the right to think, feel, and act from the inside out. The world does not fear the emotionally empty. It fears the emotionally independent, because once someone stops needing the world to feel okay, the world loses ownership of them. And ownership is the real currency of society. Not money, not status, not talent, control. And you cannot control a person who is no longer emotionally for sale.